We're live.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. Peace and blessings, greetings to all of our viewers and a hearty Ramadan Mubarak. Welcome to Islamic Perspectives on Prison Abolition, a conversation on Islam, justice, and the carceral state. This is part of Believers Bailout Digital Ramadan. Believers Bailout is a community-led effort to bail out Muslims in pretrial incarceration and ICE custody as a form of zakat, and to raise awareness within Muslim communities on the injustices of the bail bond system, immigration bonds, and the broader industrial complex from which they form a part. This event is a part of a series of events that Believers Bailout is hosting this Ramadan. In addition to, and perhaps the most important one, is the fundraiser. We launched the fundraiser yesterday in a 30 Days of Ramadan takeover on IG. And you can go to, if you want to support Believers Bailout, the address is, I believe, in the comments, but also launchgood.com/BBO2020. Some upcoming events include on May 1st, International Labor Day, a day-long digital event, A Day of Action. And May 7th, a book talk with Garrett Felber on his book on the Nation of Islam and the Carceral State. Our guests today are Shaykh Azhar Nasser and Ustadh Ubaydullah Evans. Shaykh Azhar is a graduate of the renowned Islamic seminary in Najaf, Iraq, and he shares that knowledge quite regularly via his Twitter handle @Shaykh Azhar. And Ustadh Ubaydullah Evans is a graduate of the renowned Al-Azhar University and lives on the south side of Chicago with his very lovely wife and family. And what we're going to do today, I'm going to have a series of questions that I'm going to ask our guests, and then we'll end and we'll open up for Q&A. So if you have questions, you should tweet your questions to us at Believer Bailout via Twitter. And before we begin, I'll just open with Al-Fatiha. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين الرحمن الرحيم مالك يوم الدين إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين آمين. And the English interpretation, in the name of God, the most gracious, the dispenser of grace. All praise is due to God alone, the sustainer of all the worlds, the most gracious, the dispenser of grace, Lord of the day of judgment. Thee alone do we worship, and unto thee alone do we turn for aid. Guide us the straight way, the way upon whom thou hast bestowed thy blessings, and not of those who have been condemned by thee, nor of those who go astray. And salawat on the Prophet and his family. Ameen. All right, so let's get started. Me. Sorry, I'm your moderator. I'm Dr. Abdul Khabeer. I serve as the senior editor on Sapelo Square, an online resource on Black Muslims in the United States. And I have the honor of being among the collective of individuals and organizations that founded BBO. So, our first question. So, when activists talk about abolition, they do so not just in reference to sort of prisons, but also what we might call the entire carceral imagination, meaning that the way our society responds when people break the law or go against a norm is by punishment, right? Locking them up, giving them high fines, putting them in solitary, right? As opposed to other ways you might respond when someone kind of goes against the rules. So my question to you is, what would you say are the Islamic perspective or perspectives on the best way to address what we might call social transgressions when somebody breaks the rules?
So I'll defer to Shaykh Azhar.
I knew you were going to do that. First of all, assalamu alaikum, everyone. I just wanted to thank Believers Bailout and all of the organizers for holding this session to discuss, really a very relevant topic today because, with the pandemic crisis, the condition of prisoners in prisons is really a humanitarian issue. To answer your question, what's the Islamic perspective on addressing social transgressions? I think we have to step back for a moment and really remind ourselves that Islam is a holistic tradition, and therefore it's going to have a holistic approach to social problems. And what that means is that instead of just looking at the act of the offender, the breaking of the law, we have to ask ourselves, what were the economic factors, the social factors, the family structures that contributed to the breaking of that law. When we look at it, environmental factors, was it an issue of a lack of financial resources? Was it an issue of a lack of educational opportunities? Oftentimes people commit crimes when they're desperate. It's an act of desperation. Was it because of a lack of meaningful employment opportunities? Was it because there's a prejudice against people living in poverty? There's almost like this disdain towards people who live below the poverty line. It's like it's your fault. You're in the situation because you didn't put in the work. You're a failure. Mm-hmm. Also, looking at the social factors, many of these offenders, don't have, they lack that support, the family support, that neighborhood support, that community support. We got to talk about lack of leadership in communities, the low value that we place on the well-being of children. I mean, you think about all of the single mothers out there who have to work multiple jobs and can't afford childcare. Who's looking after that child? So there are so many different factors that contribute, that are the root causes for what we call, these social aggressions. If you look at family structures, many people, come from broken families. They come from families where they experience, different kinds of abuse. So the Islamic perspective is really to step back and look at the bigger picture. We have to ask ourselves, was this a failure of an individual, or was this the failure of a state? Mm-hmm. So when you look at Surah Quraysh, and subhanAllah, there's a Quranic precedent for everything. Sometimes you read a surah and you come back to it and you find that, the answer to some of the most complex problems are embedded in the surahs that we learned as children. So I'll give you an example. If you look at Surah Quraysh, Surah 106, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and Quraysh is, this massive tribe that lived in the Arabian Peninsula. They were predominantly polytheists. What does Allah say? فَلْيَعْبُدُ رَبَّ هَذَا الْبَيْتِ الَّذِي أَطْعَمَهُم مِّن جُوعٍ وَآمَنَهُم مِّن خَوْفٍ. So here, Allah is inviting the polytheists, the pagans of Quraysh, to submit to His authority. Submitting to His authority, worshiping God, is essentially to follow His laws. But what does Allah say? Obey me, worship me, obey my laws, because I am the one who provided you with food against hunger and security against fear. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the Lord of the worlds, is saying that I am worthy of obedience because I am the one who took care of the two most important needs. I took care of your economic needs, and I gave you that sense of security. So think about it like this. How do we expect, so if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying that submit to my authority because I did my part as your Lord, how do we expect human beings to submit to human authority when we don't even provide them with their basic needs?
Thank you. That's okay. All right, Ubaydullah. Ustadh Ubayd, could you?
Bismillah. The first thing that comes to mind when you think about social transgression, if you look at our tradition, it has a very uncomfortable law, has a very uncomfortable relationship with state power. See, when we think about like traditional articulations of the Sharia, you had multiple non-state actors, scholars, fuqaha, that were adjudicating cases, but they were not sponsored by the state. See, like when we think about law as Americans or as Europeans, or as moderns, period, we think about the state being the only repository of meaning in the lives of people. Whereas in a traditional, Islamic, I would say, territory, most cases would be handled at the local level. Most redress of wrong would occur between the two people and the imam in the masjid before it even made it to the docket of a qadi, like a state-sponsored judge. So I would say the Islamic model is inherently restorative, because that non-state actor has a much wider scope in terms of the tools that he or she can employ to bring about the redress of wrong than you would have in a standardized, what we call legally monistic. See, the nation state is legally monistic, that it tries to standardize law, and justice entails one modality, right? Equality before the law entails one modality, even though this society has never had one modality. But this is how it purportedly represents itself vis-a-vis justice. Whereas traditional Islamic justice, quote unquote, was always localized. It was always between individuals and usually scholars who knew them, knew their families, knew their histories. And they would employ a wide range of strategies, tactics to bring about, restorative justice. So like where I lived in Egypt, for instance, now, a lot of people don't know that almost every crime that involves a victim in Sharia, the family of the victim, if the victim is killed, has three options. The family of the victim can choose diya, which is blood wit. They can choose money, right? If the person's guilt is established, they can choose forgiveness, or they can choose qisas. They can choose, capital punishment or punishment. But in Egypt, whether the case is involuntary manslaughter, voluntary manslaughter, or even what we call in Sharia, qatl amd, intentional murder, what the person that is guilty will do, they will wrap themselves in the kafan, in the funeral shroud, run out onto the doorstep of the victim's family, throw themselves on the doorstep. This is in southern Egypt, as though like, I'm in my funeral shroud. If you want to choose punishment, I'm already dead. And then that family almost always forgives the perpetrator.
Oh, so so you both brought up some really provocative thing, and this leads me to my next question. I think the two things that stand out for me from what you said from Shaykh Azhar is this idea of, if the state has failed, if the institutions have failed, if the system has failed, right, then we need to rethink what we think crime is and how we respond to it, right? Because of that example that you gave with the Quraysh. And then Ustadh Ubaydullah, I think what I got from you was this idea that, Islamically and sort of traditional ways in which Muslims have lived, the ways you respond to social transgressions or people break the law, sort of adding on to what he's saying is on a very local level, where you have a wide range of options to respond to how, so what we're going to do. And it reminded me too also of in your point about sort of American law, and I'm not a legal scholar, but it reminded me of the sort of efforts, for example, like critical race scholars, right, to sort of bring in a kind of broader sense, right? Because the idea is that, the law will be applied equally. Well, it's actually not being applied equally, right? So how do we address that? But your point about, this idea, so the idea that someone would kill someone in your family, right? And you have these options. And one of the options is you can have them killed, basically, right? Or you can forgive them, and that people actually choose forgiveness. This is interesting to me because one of the common objections to abolition in general, and particularly capital punishment, is this idea about what about violent crime, right? Murderers, rapists, child molesters. And so you mentioned this concept of blood money, right? And so I was wondering, I have two parts to this question. One, does the concept of blood money or forgiveness that you've introduced here suggests, right, that maybe from within Muslim tradition, right, there are alternatives to death as punishment. And two, in light of the ways in which injustices are embedded, right, in light of the ways in which the state has failed, right, and we're not guided, particularly as Muslims, by our tradition, with the death penalty in particular, could that be considered as un-Islamic, like categorically un-Islamic under these conditions?
You know, so Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Quran, كُتِبَ عَلَيْكُمُ الْقِصَاصُ فِي الْقَتْلِ, that equality has been prescribed for you in cases of killing, in cases of murder. And all traditional articulations of Sharia hold that capital punishment is something that should be averted. In fact, all hudud, all punishments, the Prophet ﷺ, this is not a secondary source. This is not a tertiary source. This is not some medieval legal scholar. The Prophet said, avoid punishing to the extent possible. If there's any shubha, if there's any doubt, avoid punishment categorically. However, the existence of those punishments as extant, they are taken to be deterrents. This is how they are treated. They are taken to be deterrents, that people would refrain from engaging in such crime because they realize that if I engage in said crime, it could cost me my life. I tend to believe that the existence of capital punishment can be an effective deterrent. I understand the logic. However, to my colleague Shaykh Azhar's point, in a situation in which you have gross social inequality, gross economic inequality, gross inequality and vulnerability, there can be no capital punishment. I feel like admitting or allowing capital punishment in that context would be like allowing someone to play with gasoline in a room full of matches. You see, so I do understand the logic of the traditional fuqaha in that the existence of capital punishment is an effective deterrent. However, the application of that punishment, the application of that had in a context anything remotely similar to ours, I think would be un-Islamic and irresponsible.
Shaykh Azhar.
So just to add on to what the Sheikh was saying, so I think when we speak about Sharia law, people often automatically equate Sharia law with criminal law. Sharia law represents the totality of Islamic teachings, the totality of Islamic law, from acts of worship to family law to civil law and so on and so forth. So to equate Sharia law with criminal law is as ridiculous as saying that American law equals criminal law. That's one dimension, that's one aspect of Sharia. Now, the point that I wanted to make here, and I think that the Sheikh has already alluded to this, is that why do we have this insistence on enforcing Islamic criminal law, but we're lax about upholding Islamic values in our community? So if you want to enforce Islamic penal code, you better be sure that Islamic values are being upheld. So for example, if you have an offender, let's say that you have someone who commits theft in our societies today. And let's say that you have someone who's gung-ho about applying the had. And let's say that we're able to substantiate that we've reached the evidentiary threshold. What needs to be done first, say we escalate this to the level of the qadi, the judge. Before we even address the act of the offender, we have to first make sure that we can absolve the state. Meaning that, do we have a welfare system in place? What was the mental condition? What was the mental condition of the offender? Did the offender have needs that should have been met by the state? So only after the state is absolved does the conversation steer to the act of the offender. And even when we talk about the act of the offender, we have to understand that what is under question is the act of the person. So we need to make a distinction between a bad person and a person who committed a bad act. But this all goes back to, Islamic penal code is applicable. And again, there's a very high evidentiary threshold, as we're going to come to discuss. If you want to apply Islamic criminal law, are you upholding Islamic family law? Are you upholding, an Islamic welfare system? Are there mechanisms in place? Are there policies in place that are bridging the gap between the rich and the poor? It goes back to kind of addressing the root causes.
Bismillah. Real quick, I know we're short on time.
Go ahead. No, we got a little bit of time. So go ahead.
But I would say on the whole, and I'm not a scholar of American civil or criminal law, either, but based on some comparative reading, it appears to me that Islamic law is just much less punitive. So if you look at something like, and this, when Western audiences talk about Islamic law, the first thing they talk about, Islamic criminal law, the cutting of hands, right? The cutting of hands. And for them, this makes Islamic law sound like Hammurabi's code or something like that, right? This harsh, repressive, draconian, barbaric. The first thing I learned when I was at Azhar was the difference between sariqa, literally grand larceny, and ikhtilas, pilfering, which is like, a person takes, a little bit here, a little bit there. And one of the conditions to establish sariqa was that the person taking cannot feel in any way that they were entitled to what they were taking. See, if the person, so say I'm working for someone and I feel like I'm underpaid and I feel like I'm being exploited and I steal from the register. If I can establish that, in fact, I am being underpaid and I am being exploited, that is not sariqa, no matter how much I stole from the register. That's called, there was a part of me that felt entitled to what I took. Now, as a Black man in America, I don't know what I could steal that I wouldn't feel, no, we built this country.
Right.
I don't know, and we still have not received reparations.
Right.
I don't know what I could take that I might not feel like, I feel like I was entitled to that.
I wonder, what you said just made me, I had a thought, I wonder if the punishment, if the cutting of the hand punishment, if in fact it would have been a deterrent for, all the banks that have stolen from everyone, right?
All of them.
Right. But on a more serious note, you bring up a point though, right? Because I think this is true for a lot of non-Muslim audiences, particularly the United States, and in North America, in Europe, right? But also Muslim audiences where like Islamic law, which again gets boiled down, as Shaykh Azhar noted, as only criminal law, right? But it gets boiled down and it becomes this very harsh thing, right? Like you said, so all these punishments, you killed for this, you're stoned for this, your hand gets cut off for that. And I was just wondering, and based on what you were saying, I guess I had a question, but I guess maybe you can confirm this, because it sounds to me, because when I think about this, like I think about the stories I've heard growing up, right? About I think it was a man who approached Prophet Muhammad and I think he had committed adultery and he was trying to confess, and the Prophet's like turning his face because he doesn't want to hear it, right? Because he doesn't want to meet out the punishment. Or this idea that someone, they stole but they were hungry, so there wasn't a punishment for that. And so I was wondering if that means that, that perhaps we don't, both within and outside of communities, we actually don't have an accurate understanding or depiction of how the law works, right? Like how it works in word, but also in deed, like how it actually has historically been enacted.
Yeah, we don't have, Shaykh Azhar, do you wanna take this one?
Well, I'll just a quick comment. I think that, when you look at hudud, because in Islamic criminal law, we have two categories of punishments. We have what is known as hudud, which are the fixed punishments. Basically, the Sharia has determined what the appropriate punishment should be, given that the evidentiary threshold is met. And then you have crimes where the Sharia really hasn't given any guidance on what the prescribed punishment should be. And these are known as ta'zirat, which are the discretionary punishments. Now, some of the hudud, I'll be honest with you, some of the hudud on paper, it's pretty intense. It seems very harsh. Now, I think we need to make a distinction between the theoretical sentence and the process through which we arrive at the sentence. So, for example, when we think about the had for zina in its most extreme form, do you know how? How is it possible, really, if you think about it? What is the probability that sexual intercourse will take place in the presence of 4 people? And we're not just talking about any 4 people. You're talking about 4 righteous people who willingly, who decide to participate in a trial, who are going to give exact eyewitness testimony, meaning there's going to be no contradiction. It's a risk to even testify, because if anyone contradicts your testimony, you will be liable for another had, which is slander, which is qadh. So what is the probability that someone committing fornication, and we're talking about sexual intercourse, that is witnessed by 4 righteous people, people of great repute, and they give the same exact eyewitness testimony? It's virtually impossible to meet that evidentiary threshold. So it seems that the harshness of the sentence is there to reflect the abhorrence of the act. Because the Sharia is designed for these punishments to be extremely difficult to enforce.
And also too, one of the things that I think is, it's disturbing, because I see it in Muslim communities and in non-Muslim communities, is that there's a certain fetishization of law. This idea that law has some magical power in it, that it's going to solve all of our problems, and that we have to somehow make all of our issues legal issues. And, a lot of this is best dealt with on the level of conflict resolution. This is not, we're not talking, these aren't legal issues, but I feel like Americans especially, they fetishize law. We are a very litigious people. We sue each other all the time, right? What we really need to be is just more community oriented, more community focused. I have an issue with someone. How can I resolve this issue? It's probably not a legal issue at all. And you see that in the seerah of the Prophet ﷺ, people that came to him with issues that he could have made legal, he did not make them legal, right? So that man is confessing adultery. He could say, Iqamatul had, I have to establish the had. The Prophet ﷺ actually says, why are you telling me this? Why are you telling me this? Right? At one point in one riwayah, he says, Abika Junoon? Are you crazy? Are you why are you? Because we don't have to make this a legal issue, right? We don't have to make it. Once, Sayyidina Ali, karramallahu wajh, was on his way to get married, and Sayyidina Hamza, radiallahu anh, actually took his camel and mutilated the camel. And the Prophet ﷺ stepped up to intervene. And Sayyidina Hamza said something that he shouldn't have said to the Prophet ﷺ. And the Prophet later on just told him, replace and indemnify Ali. Replace but the idea that this was criminal destruction of property. And that doesn't even come into the picture. Yeah. Just indemnify the man. Just restore what you destroyed. That's it.
Yeah. It's interesting what you describe. I think both of your reflections, I think, again, speak to sort of the opening question, is carceral imagination. So I think part of the sort of fetish or around the law, some of it I think has to do with, everything here has to do with white supremacy. So I think some of it has to do with the ways in which, right, law and legality and rationality become the sort of foundations upon which a white supremacist imagination, justifies itself, right? We do these things this way. And then in order to maintain your supremacy over other people, right, the carceral imagination sort of emerges. I was recently in South Africa earlier this year, and there's a famous place in South Africa called Robben Island, right, where Nelson Mandela was imprisoned. I did not know this. I learned this in South Africa, that Nelson Mandela has been, Robben Island has been a prison since the Dutch got to South Africa. So since like the 1700s, right?
Mhm.
So this idea of like, or actually even before that, so this idea of like punishment and force and all these things that you have, like this kind of harshness and this confinement and the fines and the punishment and the confinement as a part of maintaining the system, right? As a part of maintaining sort of your power and control.
That's it. That's it.
And it makes me think about, and the reason why I asked the question about whether or not the death penalty is un-Islamic, and this leads me to my next question, is because I do feel like as a Muslim, as a regular Muslim, you know, one of my experiences in community is that, you know, oftentimes people are, you may see that this is something wrong, right? Like, for example, that people are being killed unjustly, but as a Muslim, you're like, but the Quran says X, right? So how can I say we shouldn't do this? Like people feel like, you know, I can't be against something because if I'm against it in this way, you know, this kind of way. So I was wondering, so related to that, I was wondering, you know, what do you think? Because to me, that's a challenge around abolition, right? The idea that Muslims have a particular kind of understanding what they think Islamic law looks like and how it should be handled. And therefore they, even though they don't live in a Muslim majority place, they're not living under these rules, they still personally have to find ways to abide by them, right? So to me, that's one of the biggest challenges to abolition in our communities. But I wonder, what do you think may be the biggest challenge to an Islamic worldview or an Islamic perspective when engaging the concept of tradition, of abolition? Is it something that comes from within the tradition itself, or is it about how we understand our traditions?
I think if, Shaykh Azhar, do you mind if I go ahead or you want to go ahead?
Go ahead.
Bismillah. I think, you know, some Muslims mistakenly assume that the opposition to this carceral state is anarchy. That's what they think, you know, and there's so much in our tradition about fawda, about anarchy, and how, you know, we are not people of anarchy. Some Muslims, and when I hear it, it's abhorrent to me. I hear Muslims actually parroting this law and order. I'm thinking, do you know the kind of people who say law and order? Don't ever let me hear you say that. But I think they have a sense that we are a people who believe in the redress of wrong. We believe in justice. We believe in you know, law. We believe in order. And I think that they're not making a connection between abolition and reimagining justice. See, some of them think abolition, chaos. Abolition, no justice. And as Muslims, I think they have an inherent sense that, no, we're not people of anarchy. We're not people of chaos. And I think, you know, if I'm, you know, not to, you know, I hate using these, you know, controversial buzzwords. I think, you know, we have to become more imaginative, and we have to break out of these boxes of right and left. And because there is some, you know, similarity in the discourse of Muslims that are serious about abolition and leftists that are really anarchists, you know, some of them are actually anarchists. And because some of that discourse bears, you know, similarity, that we just, without listening, we just assume that a person is advocating, you know, anarchy or chaos, when the only thing they're doing is actually advocating justice, but a reimagining of justice, you know, shorn of white supremacy, of the impact of social inequality and anti-Black racism and such maladies. You know,
the patriarchy. I know you wanted to add that one.
not exactly, but that's,
yes.
only because even now, I mean, if you look at the punitive state, you know, women are actually prosecuted much less.
We'll come back to that. But Shaykh Azhar, Shaykh Azhar, would you like to? What do you think about the challenges?
So I think that I think we have to first define like what constitutes a prison in the Muslim mind. You know, when we speak about abolition, what are we talking about? Are we talking about prison as it exists today? You know, the privatization of prison and all of the problems that go along with that. I mean, when you think about prisoners during the time of the Prophet. See, we associate prison with people in cages.
Mhm.
Like after the Battle of Badr, right? You have people who you can consider offenders. These are people who tried to kill Muslims. They tried to kill the Prophet. They became the Prophet's captives. They were his prisoners. And there's a very interesting conversation that the Prophet has. So he has these prisoners, the first battle of Islam. What do we do with these prisoners? Notice the Prophet doesn't say, okay, someone, build a bunch of cages, let's throw them in cages. One of the companions of the Prophet suggests that why don't we ransom them?
Mm-hmm.
What does the Prophet say? He vehemently rejects that. So ransoming a prisoner is basically approaching the prisoner with a financial incentive. Let's try to make money off of them.
Mm-hmm.
The Prophet ﷺ says, no, let them use whatever skill sets they have. So, education, lack of education is a big problem. We have a problem with literacy. If any of these prisoners are able to read and write, let them teach, 10 Muslims how to read and write, and they can be freed. So these were prisoners. But the Prophet didn't put them in cages. Even if you go to Surah Al-Dahab, Surah Al-Insan, the famous verse, and all commentators are unanimous about, when Imam Ali and Fatima al-Zahra, when their sons Hassan and Hussein became sick, they made a solemn vow that if they recover, we will fast for 3 days. And then every night, every evening, when they were about to break the fast, there was a knock at the door. وَيُطْعِمُونَ الطَّعَامَ عَلَى حُبِّهِ مِسْكِينًا وَيَتِيمًا وَأَسِيرًا. On the third day, the person who came and knocked on the door and was asking them for food was what? Was who? An asir. Was a captive, a prisoner. Now my question is, why was the captive roaming around Medina? If it's a captive, you would imagine it should have been in a prison cell. Mm-hmm. So a prisoner in Medina was not a person that was locked away in a cage. Mm-hmm. They were part of the community. There were certain expectations, but they were part of the community. They were not dehumanized. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So I think it's important to define, okay, what is a prison? Like when we talk about abolishing prisons, it creates a problem. So if we say that prison in all its forms is un-Islamic, you're going to fall into a problem here, because Imam Ali alayhi salam had prisons, but a prisoner in the state of Imam Ali alayhi salam was permitted to attend Friday prayer on a weekly basis. And I'm not talking about Friday prayer in the prison. I'm talking about attending the mosque. Mm-hmm. So you see this kind of reintegration of the offender back into the community. So I think Islam offers us so many different ways to reimagine what it means to be a prisoner and what prison actually looks like, how to rehabilitate people.
No, and just to add to that too, I mean, if you look at, just take a broad swath of Sunni legal tradition, you don't really have prisons, even as certainly not as hudud, like prescribed punishments, and even not as ta'zir, discretionary punishments. You really don't have a concept of like imprisonment as, yes, a person can be a prisoner of war, but not imprisonment, after one is found guilty of a crime. That doesn't exist really in our tradition, and certainly not as any kind of pretrial detainee. That is
there's no bail bonds.
No, that's actually called enslavement in our tradition.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think a couple things that you both spoke to that were interesting to me. I think your point, Ustadh Ubaydullah, about anarchy is an interesting one, as if we're not living in chaos. So, I mean, I understand that, I understand the point, right? And the idea that, yes, in the United States, for example, there are sort of, life has a particular pattern and things happen with some sense of regularity, right? Which is a sense of order, right? But the rates at which Black people, Latinx people are incarcerated, right? The rates at which, sort of children are being taken from their parents,
it's already chaotic.
Yeah, this is chaos. So I think to the point about anarchy and that concern, I just want to add that I think that that's important to sort of also similar to Shaykh Azhar's point about thinking holistically, right? So if we want to think holistically about Islamic tradition, we should also think holistically about the environments in which we're living in right now, right? Mm-hmm. And so, you know, is this in fact what we want, right? And if this is not what we want, how do we get to something that's better and much more closer to our tradition? Mm-hmm. I think the other thing I think is interesting, and I know this came up, and I'm sure it's okay for me to mention this, Shaykh Azhar, because you were saying you're not complete abolitionists, right? You're saying, right, and in part because I think it sounds to me in part because of the idea that prison in a form, right, or imprisonment in a form has existed in Muslim tradition, right? But I think, I would say that even in that case, I think you might still be able to call yourself an abolitionist, right? Because none of those forms what we deal with right now, right? And I think part of what abolition also is about is imagining and reimagining, right? How can we do this, right? So, you know, if someone causes harm to someone else, right? Well, how can we respond to this? Because harm will happen because we're human, and that happens, right? People will hurt other people. Sometimes it'll be small things, sometimes they'll be much larger. But I think part of the call for abolition is this idea of let's imagine that, right? And that brings me to my sort of next question. And you kind of started with this, Shaykh Azhar, so maybe you might want to take this first, right? But what does the Islamic tradition, or what might the Islamic tradition offer, right, to the conceptualization of abolition to make it more dynamic or to bring a greater social good?
So I think, just as Shaykh Ubaydullah mentioned, that, you know, a lot of the problems that we have in our communities can be, you know, so I think the redressing of wrongs should not escalate to litigation. You know, I think, you know, keeping it at the community level. I mean, it's sad that, you know, people, you know, husband and wife, they get into a fight, and then everybody lawyers up, and then they're stuck in court for 2-3 years. That doesn't need to happen. Go to a scholar, you know, get some arbiters, and you can resolve it. You can save a lot of money, and you can resolve the problem in a swift fashion. So I think resolving, you know, transgressions, social transgressions, problems on the community level, it's economically efficient and it's time efficient. Secondly, I think that, you know, from an Islamic perspective, I think that we need to create a movement to abolish privatized prisons. I think that it is impossible to have a justice system that is built on making money off of prisoners. I mean, because a prisoner is essentially a customer, and a business can only thrive if you are able to acquire customers. So the entire privatization of prisons is inherently flawed, and I think that we need to do away with it. We have to also provide offenders with needs. You know, a couple months ago, you know, I was in contact with you know, I have a friend who sends books to prisoners. And I mean, at least in Canada, it's a really difficult process. Like, why is it so difficult to deliver books to a prisoner? We're not delivering like an AK-47, like it's a book. What, you know what I mean? Like, why is it so difficult for people to receive basic needs? I think it's also important that we raise the evidentiary threshold. You know, I don't believe in this, this whole jury of your peers model. I think it's flawed, and so I think we have to raise the evidentiary threshold and make the sentencing a lot more difficult. That, you know, there needs to truly be, you know, no reasonable doubt if you're going to convict people. And in Islamic government, most of the people who are in prison, they don't meet the evidentiary threshold. So, you know, we have what, 2.3 million prisoners in the U.S. You know, if Sharia law was governing the U.S., that number would drop probably by 95%, 99%. Because in an Islamic legal system, the evidentiary threshold would not be met. And even, I mean, going back to Shaykh Ubaydullah's point, I mean, even if we look at, you know, discretionary punishments, I would imagine that a qadi in this time would determine that there are other ways to address these issues than to put a human being in a cage. I also think that, you know, the idea of reintegrating offenders back into the community. I mean, I love the story of Imam Ali ibn Abi Talib allowing prisoners to attend Friday prayer, right? And the Imam would not send prisoner guards. He would just say that, I need a guarantor from the family that the person is going to come back and go to that state of isolation. So it's not that they attend Friday prayer in prison. No, they actually are reintegrated back into the community. They feel that they're a part of the community, so they're not othered. Prison labor. The forest fires in California. Who do you think was extinguishing those fires? Many of them were prisoners who were getting paid pennies on the dollar. That's un-Islamic. People need to be paid fair wages. So, these are some of the things that I think we can introduce to move towards at least some degree of prison abolishment.
Bismillah. I want to speak to that too. I mean, this is a place where I think we need to pursue an Islamic secular, and I'm using that term intentionally. One of the handicaps of being someone with a sacred history is that you tend to rely on that sacred history when you should be relying on your creativity. So that the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ and the tradition has given us some very specific outlines and parameters that we have to act inside of. Inside of those, however, we have free reign to come up with what best suits our situation. So like Shaykh Azhar was mentioning, ta'zirat, discretionary punishments. Most people that were found guilty of having committed wrong, they never ever reached the evidentiary burden of having a had applied to them, having like one of these punishments that are prescribed. A had is like a prescribed punishment. Most of them were, punished vis-a-vis some discretionary punishment that was developed by a judge or was employed in communities. And I don't know why we, as Muslim moderns, don't feel empowered to do the same thing. Or as people in community with other people, that we don't feel empowered to do the same thing. This is like when we find that our tradition is maskuut an, it's silent about something. That's an intentional silence. When the Quran has not given us specific guidance with regard to how we deal with somebody that's not paying their child support. That's an intentional silence. We have to then develop how we're going to go about dealing with someone that does not pay their child support.
Yeah, I mean, I think your point, actually, one of the things that so a couple of things that I wanted to sort of bring up, but then we have some questions from the audience. But I think, so one, I think it's, I'm thinking about what does an abolition or this kind of perspective or this Islamic perspective that you've been presenting, what does that look like in community life, right? So I'm thinking about, so you mentioned, Shaykh Azhar mentioned if a husband and a wife have an argument and they go to lawyers. It's like, one of the issues that we have in our communities, for example, is domestic violence, right? And I grew up in a community, in a predominantly Black Muslim community, where we did not want to call the police, right? That was not something you would do because you knew what that would mean. But oftentimes our institutions, particularly like the masajid, failed the women who were being abused, right? So people joke, well, then I'm going to call a man on you, right? Because I don't want to call the police. There's a non-carceral way to handle domestic violence. But if I depend on the institutions in my community, right, that because of the patriarchy, we'll get back to that, right, are not providing the kind of support, right, that I need as someone suffering from violence. So I'm wondering just if you might be able to speak to that maybe in terms of like what does it look like, or either what does it look like, or what are the things we need to try to put in place so this kind of non-punitive, restorative, transformative, right, way of dealing with social transgression, right, that's embedded in our tradition can come to life in our communities like now,
Bismillah. I'd like to speak to that. I think what that really boils down to, Dr. Suad, is finding the courage to speak truth to pain. See, everybody talks about, أفضل جهاد كلمة حق عند سلطان جائر. The best jihad, the best struggle in the way of God is to speak truth before a corrupt or tyrannical ruler. But what about speaking truth to pain? That just because you have been wronged does not mean that the answer is seeing this person in prison or seeing this person beat up. Because I know a lot of sisters, look, you want to get, Suad, can we keep it 100?
Keep it 100.
Can we keep it 100?
And that wasn't necessarily the best thing, but
no,
that wasn't.
That was definitely from the ikhtiyarat. It's like brothers with a sister is there saying there's a domestic situation. Do you want us to put the fops on the brother? Do you want us to put the bats on him? Mm-hmm. I think being able to tell someone, okay, this happened, and there's a way that we can restore justice. Will you be okay with that? The person that was actually offended against, the person that was harmed. So I think, our turn toward restorative justice, it has to be a holistic turn. It can't just be, okay, what are we going to do about the people that make mistakes and commit offenses? What about the people that have offenses committed against them? And that's a much more, I don't want to get too personal, some of them cases still open, you know what I'm saying? But, I don't want to get too personal, but, that is actually much more difficult. How do you say to someone whose relative was killed, we want to sit down, we want to mediate, when they're thinking mediate, man, we about to go take care of it. We about to go do this now. Right. It's like, how do you say to that person, no, actually, that would only exacerbate the problem. Mm-hmm. If you went and did this now, that would only make things worse. You can't do that. Mm-hmm. And we don't want this person to stand before some racist judge and be given a sentence of 45 years to life. Mm-hmm. We're going to have to figure out a third way. Yeah. Will that person be okay with that?
Right. Shaykh Azhar, did you want to respond?
Yeah, I think an effective solution is that every masjid, every community needs an official arbitration committee. And I'm talking about, on this committee, you have an alim, you have an Islamic scholar to make sure that all of the, everything, all of the advice that's being given is within the parameters of the Sharia. So you have a scholar. I'm talking an arbitration committee comprised of an Islamic scholar, preferably male and female, because it's always important to get, both perspectives. Family counselors, psychologists, therapists, and really have that service available. So if people are having conflicts, they can go to this committee. They're ensured that it's going to be confidential. And this is something that needs to be supported by the community. So we have to consider that in the same way that we got to keep the lights on in the masjid, we have to fund this committee. These people should be paid salaries, so it becomes their primary work, because arbitration cannot just happen at the side of your desk. These are people that need to be fully dedicated to this type of work.
Thank you. So I want to move to a couple questions from the audience. I know one of the things, there's a thing about language sometimes, and like, I know Shaykh Azhar, you were talking about offenders when they come back into the community, and people, it's like, well, people are incarcerated, doesn't mean they offended, right? That type of thing. And so one of the questions was, you mentioned a difference. The question from the audience is, question for Shaykh Azhar's earlier comment, in terms of a quote unquote bad person versus a good person who does bad, what distinguishes the two? What are the Islamic criteria to make this distinction?
So again, ultimately, we can't label a person as a bad person, right? Because we don't know the inner workings of people's hearts. We can identify that this action was un-Islamic. This action caused harm. But good people, involuntarily cause harm. It happens. We're human beings. So that distinction is really more of a spiritual distinction that you as a person, when you're looking at this, make sure that you don't cast judgment on that person, that you have to make that distinction between the action and the actor. I mean, that's the only point that I wanted to make.
Okay. Another question from the audience is, what role should mosques/community leaders take in supporting community rehabilitation, especially in the time of the war on terror and heightened surveillance?
I'll let Shaykh Azhar, maybe you can speak to that.
Can you repeat that question?
Yes. What role should mosques/community leaders take in supporting community rehabilitation, especially in the time of war, in this time of a war on terror and heightened surveillance? So what I understand the question to be asking is that, Muslims are overrepresented in prisons, right? It's funny, you asked the question earlier about AK-47s and books, and I was thinking to myself about Malcolm, right? And it's like, the reason why they don't want people, because books are like AK-47s, right? People get enlightened, they learn, they get knowledge of self, and then they change the world, right? But I think, but this idea of that, right? We know, for example, there have been a number of cases where people, precisely because they're vulnerable, because they were formerly incarcerated, right? Or because they have a case, right? They get picked on, right? To sort of try to infiltrate a community, right? Like this happens regularly, right? Yeah. And so I guess the question is sort of asking, like, how should we handle that, right? You want to help people who need help in your community because they're vulnerable, but they're also vulnerable, right, to being targeted, to become sort of informants and to become destabilizers in the community.
That's a big problem. I mean, it's a problem in the US, it's a problem here, even in Canada. I mean, people that I know have been approached by law enforcement to essentially act as informants. I think that masajid, the mosque of the Prophet in Medina was more than just a place where Muslims came and prayed and Muslims came and listened to sermons. It was a place of political discourse. It was a place where people came to talk about, community problems. So this is a community problem. So I think that one thing that mosques can do is that we need to start holding more, know your rights seminars. A lot of people in our community, especially, I think about my parents and my grandparents, they come from parts of the world where there is a paralyzing fear of law enforcement. They feel that if an officer asks you a question, you are obligated to give them information. So teaching our community members that you have rights, you are under no legal obligation to give information to law enforcement, to be used as a tool by law enforcement. So I think one simple solution is that we need to have, so in addition to the khutbahs and the halaqas, we need to have a know your rights type of seminar. And I think organizations like CARE do offer those types of programs, but I think we need to make them, we need to hold them more frequently.
Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. I think that, we need to, try to inject some self-respect, back into our community. One of the most difficult assignments that I ever had, as someone kind of working in in the capacity of a scholar, within the community, is I got called into a courtroom as an expert witness during some divorce proceedings. And it just gave me a dirty feeling, man. It was like, I was being paid to be there. And, the judge is, of course, being paid, and both attorneys are being paid. And I felt in that moment two things. One, we are all here like crows, feasting on the carcass of this dead marriage, right? Filling our pockets with money, because you had two people, and you could clearly see during the trial that these were two people that could not work out issues that they had emotionally. And it just spilled over into court. That somehow, because they could not resolve some emotional conflict that existed between them, the artifice of law was chosen to as like the weapon of choice. The second thing I felt was for me to go up, and I didn't even know the woman that was in the courtroom that afternoon, but for me to go up talking about my tradition as though it's just some little accoutrement in the pursuit of justice, but she is presiding over the real tradition of justice, made me feel like, wait a minute, I thought the izzah, I thought the dignity, I thought the self-respect was with the believers. Yeah. Right? It's like, what are we doing? I mean, she was asking me about Islamic law in the most prosaic way. So tell us about how, it was almost like, this is like like I said, a little accoutrement, like real justice will be dispensed in my courtroom. But tell us about that little thing that you have, right? Tell us about your little tradition, right? And I think that people that work with law enforcement, the first thing that I see is that you don't believe that we're capable of actually pursuing justice inside our community. Sure. You actually don't believe that we can do it. So when I tell people, look, if they talk to you, you tell them, if we have such elements in our community, like you do have some destructively violent elements, I'm talking about on the terrorism side, in our community, like it's not. Hey, I've been in a few basements where I say, y'all gonna do what? Stuck for the law, what to be like, what? That's silly. Now I probably shouldn't have said that.
That's what I'm saying. Are you sure you've been in some basements? I don't think
I have not been in any basement. What am I saying? So when the picture went to you, I imagine that me, you, and my wife were sitting around the table again. But this is being recorded. What am I? Right. Hey, next question. Next question. Next question.
Dr. Scott, if I could just chime in for a second.
Yeah.
Next question.
I think Muslims, especially living in the West, we have to understand that law enforcement, our tax dollars pay their salaries. Like, we have to approach them as, dude, you work for me. It's the month of Ramadan. What are you doing to ensure that the Muslim community is safe? You know what I mean? Like, why do we always feel like we work for them? That, that I have to help. No, you let us know. Like, earn your money. Your salary is paid by my tax dollars. So you articulate what you guys are going to do to ensure that the Muslim community is safe, that all vulnerable communities are safe. So we have to put the onus on them. Why are we always being put to work? Go be an informant, do this, do that. You work.
I mean, I think I guess
no,
two
let me,
things.
I do want to finish.
Yeah. Yes.
So that if we had some of those elements that are of concern to law enforcement in our community, that the person should trust that we are going to we can deal with that more effectively than they can.
Right.
Through education, through teaching, through dialogue, through conversation, we can actually deal with these misguided youth. We can deal with some of these frustrated youth. We can deal with some of these people dealing with the maddening effect of racism. We can deal with them more effectively than you can. But if you don't believe that about yourself, then you are relying on these people to dispense justice.
True.
Yeah. I mean, I think I appreciate both of your responses to that question. I think, Shaykh Azhar, one of the things that you mentioned about knowing your rights, I think also extends to, I think, I appreciate the fact that the first response wasn't like, well, let's figure out how to, scan people better, or, you know what I mean, in terms of when they come into the masjid. So we know, we're not looking, like, if you see something, say something. We're not bringing that into our communities, right? But rather, it's the idea that, within our own communities, that people are vulnerable, and we need to help shore up people's vulnerability. So one way to shore up a vulnerability is by educating our communities about rights. Another way to shore up vulnerability is to provide the kind of resources, this kind of food we talked about in Soto Quraysh, right? Provide food and that freedom from fear, right? That Allah offers, right? To try to provide that when our community members come out of prison, right? And when they re-enter into our communities, right? That we can provide that. And I want to mention one thing. We posted today on Sapelo Square was a special article today. It was a review of this film, The Honest Struggle, by a journalist. Right? The film is by Justin Mashouf, but the journalist who wrote the article, his name is Rashid Shabazz, and part of what he talks about is this question of reentry, and he identifies a series of organizations in our community nationally that work on reentry, right? So that's also something that we can, I think, provide. And I think with the police, you know, I'm also abolish the police, so I don't want them to do their job because I don't think that their job is going to help any of us. But I appreciate your point, Ustadh Ubayd, too, in the sense of, which relates to what Shaykh Azhar is saying, is that we can handle this ourselves, right? So whatever the issue is, right, whatever the kind of concern is, right, if in fact it is valid, most of the time it isn't, but right, because even this question is about people are not looking to do stuff, right, but it's like, I'm gonna catch a case. They say they're gonna do this to me if I don't do that, right? This kind of thing. So how do we better sort of, take care of ourselves, take care of each other? So we are just about out of time. I wanted to sort of, if you guys have any last things you want to say, and then I'll close it out.
Shaykh Azhar, please.
I mean, I think we covered, everything that I personally wanted to touch on. I think it would be nice to have a more in-depth discussion on how to abolish privatized prisons. Like, I mean, what are the steps that need to be taken to make that a reality? And I also think that Shaykh Ubaydullah just needs a Twitter account, man. Like, you are non-existent, man. If you're not, what social media platform do you have, Shaykh?
None whatsoever. And see, I don't say that, it's not that I think that makes me unique or makes me cool, or it's just that I'm uncomfortable with how out of control I would be with the technology, right? With the platform. The message gets out there, and I feel like, and my wife can attest to this, I'm an acquired taste, man. I'm locally loved, but if someone didn't know me, they might get the wrong idea about me.
But Sheikh, you know what? It's been a good learning experience for me. I mean, it's taught me that you got to develop thick skin. You got to be able to take criticism. So I mean, for example, when I work in a local community, everybody knows you, and they give you the benefit of the doubt. But when you step into the world of social media and you're speaking to a wide range of people, it's going to force you very quickly to develop thick skin, because
for sure,
you're not going to hear the mashallahs all the time. People are going to
exactly.
So it
for sure,
forces you to refine your words. Not that your words need any refinement, but I think it's a
my words need plenty of refinement.
And I think you have a lot to offer. And if you join Twitter, I promise that I'll follow you, man.
We'll see what happens, man. I think I don't know how much I have to say, but I think at the very least I have a lot to learn from following other public intellectual speakers, teachers, writers, poets, playwrights, performers. So it's something I've been contemplating, man. Maybe that'll be my Eid gift to myself.
You gotta use the wasila, man. You got zakatul ilmi nashru, right? You gotta.
No. Look, you're absolutely right, and a lot of this has really just been a lot of selfishness. I think I enjoy the anonymity that I have.
No, I like to stay in my little corner over here. No,
Hey, look, I do my thing and make the contribution I can make, and. But
to Shaykh Azhar's point, and I think maybe we can close out on this too, whether it's, social media or not, I think both of you, right, have, I think, really presented a really expansive, but also deeply grounded, right, understanding of sort of the Islamic tradition that we actually, quite frankly, don't often get access to, whether it's on social media or offline, right? And so I think in whatever medium chosen, I think we would all benefit, right? For more engagement, right? More sort of ways of learning, right? From both of you, I think, which would be.
Dr. Saad, I think we live in a time where some of the most powerful social movements begin on social media. So if we want to take this movement forward, where do you think the millennials are? They're all on like social media. How do you reach them? Yeah. I mean, you're preaching to the uncle, at the masjid.
Yeah.
You know, Abdullah, who's 18, is on Twitter. He's on TikTok.
You're absolutely right, Shaykh Azhar. I just want to say,
yes,
I want to give my final thought.
Go ahead. Yes.
My final thought, inshallah, I want to just thank you, thank Shaykh Azhar, thank Hoda, thank Dr. Maryam Kashani, and all of the people that, you know, work on the Believers Bailout campaign. I can say with no hyperbole attached to my statement, I do have some ma'asul al-kalam, we call sweet talk, but I reserve that for other spaces. Certainly not, you know, a Zoom meeting. I've never been prouder of an Islamic movement. I feel like this is a movement that is drawing on the best of our tradition. And I think the spiritual benefit of BBO is that it's forcing us to think of ourselves as moderns in less grandiose ways. I think when we think, human bondage and enslavement was an issue in the time of the Prophet ﷺ, and he had to address the issue with the means at his disposal, and it's still an issue in our time. And we have to address the problem with the means at our disposal. I think we begin to see a continuum between his struggle and ours, instead of assuming this morally superior posture to the past, that if you are educated, especially in the human sciences in the West, you're calibrated in that way. You're calibrated to see yourself as somehow morally more mature than the people of the past. And I think BBO, in a very real way, shows that no, we're struggling with the same issues, using different strategies in our struggle, but we're still struggling with this, right? And if we can do as good a job as some of the people of the past did, or perhaps even a better job, maybe we can finish what they started and abolish this thing altogether. That will be something Allah is pleased with.
And may Allah be pleased with this work. I think Believers Bailout, as you mentioned, is I think one of the things that has been most powerful about the work is really connecting a very contemporary issue, mass incarceration, right, to the tradition. You know, what is the uphill road, right, and this idea of often sometimes in our lives, in a slightly different way from how you were saying it, but the tradition is something that is ossified, it's there, it happened, and we don't always see how it's completely applicable right now at this time. And so one of the fantastic things for BBO for me has been the ways in which it sort of revitalizes and rejuvenates, right? The ways in which you can engage, right? The Quran and the tradition of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ. And so on that note, I want to encourage everybody to stay tuned for the future events that are happening during Believers Bailout 2020 Digital Ramadan. Again, there is, of course, the fundraiser, right? I think over the past, since BBO started in 2018, I believe there've been about $300,000 has been raised over that time, and at least 11 people have been freed from pretrial detention and ICE incarceration. And so we want to continue to do that. You know, we're going to free our people ourselves, right? Until this system until we can end this system, we're going to free them all, right? And launchgood.com/BBO 2020 is for the fundraiser. May 1st is a day of action. May 7th is a book talk. And I'll just close us out with Surah Al-Asr. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والعصر إن الإنسان لفي خسر إلا الذين آمنوا وعملوا الصالحات وتواصوا بالحق وتواصوا بالصبر. In the English interpretation, in the name of God, the most gracious, the dispenser of grace, consider the flight of time. Verily, humanity is bound to lose itself unless they be of those who attain faith and do good works and enjoin upon one another the keeping to truth and enjoin upon one another patience in adversity. And on that note, Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. It's only the second day of Ramadan. Suad is probably finished with one khatam already. I got